Shalom and good evening. Welcome to our Torah Tidbits of Congregation Ahava Torah. We're in the middle of studying an article that was written by Ariel Berkowitz on how to study the Torah. Last week we had left off on point number 5, that was understanding the text at face value and avoiding the temptation to allegorize. We had said that we need to be aware of what we're reading and the context of what it's written in. Specifically, if it's a poetic passage of the Torah, we would interpret that figuratively because that's the manner and the nature of poetry. Closely associated with this principle of interpreting based on what type of writing it is a principle that it is necessary of determining the intended meaning of the passage. Since Moses was the writer of the Torah, we must try to put ourselves into his shoes as he wrote it, even as we attempt to discern our master's intent in giving each teaching. Moreover, we also need to put ourselves into the shoes of the people who first received the scriptures to seek to understand how they would have understood that. Perhaps we can clarify something important here. There is a big difference between saying this passage means such and saying this passage can serve as an illustration of such and such. The former statement assigns a specifically intended meaning to the passage, whereas the latter is merely saying that the passage might help us to understand another passage or a concept. This is a very important point, not to assign a very definite passage unless we have thoroughly determined through careful observation and application of the context its original Elohim intended meaning. But you can use almost any passage to illustrate a spiritual principle without declaring it to be the original purpose of the passage. So that's a very important concept. Refer to it as this passage can serve as an illustration of such and such. Something to be aware of is we can often spiritualize or allegorize when attempting to apply a passage of Scripture to our lives. Practical application should be the last step in our study of the passage. When the time comes to personally apply the passage to our lives, we often make a mistake of being dishonest in handling it. We can best explain this mistake by giving the illustration of looking at Joshua, for instance. Many people would say something like this: we are all Joshuas. We're all living in the day of Joshua. We can all conquer the land for the Lord. Unfortunately, such teaching is dishonest to the text. We are not all named Joshua. Moreover, who says we are living in the days of Joshua? Do we ride chariots? Are there Canaanites living around us? Furthermore, did Elohim give us all a mandate to take up swords, form an army, and conquer the land of, the United States, Germany, South Africa, or any other nation in and around us? However, we could say something like, just as in the days of Joshua, so also in our days. The key phrases we want to use here are just as and so also. We can draw many examples of what Elohim did in Joshua's day to illustrate what he might be doing today. I know this probably has come across as a complicated point, but it is important. We want to be fair and true to the text of Scripture because it is Elohim's word. We should not arbitrarily assign meanings to the Bible which are not warranted. Moving on to point 6. knowing the historical, geographical, cultural, and religious backgrounds of the passage. Too much cannot be said on this point. The Torah was written in a historical, cultural, social, religious, and geographical context very far removed from our own. We cannot even think of understanding it properly unless we are sufficiently familiar with these factors. For example, it makes a difference to our understanding of the Torah if we know that each of the 10 plagues was brought against one of the deities of Egypt. It changes our perception of the book of Deuteronomy, or if we are aware that its format virtually follows that of other Middle to late Bronze Age suzerainty treaties and covenants. The suzerainty are the feudal lords that existed in that time, and they would make treaties and covenants with each other. Moreover, are we aware that our knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets can help us understand the structure of Genesis, as well as why Rachel stole the family idols from Laban? Finally, what is meant by the designations, the way of the Philistines and the King's Highway? A knowledge of the ancient Near East can open up the meaning of the Torah in ways that most people would never imagine. We would even suggest that a student who ignores this area of knowledge risks grossly misinterpreting the Torah, as he will never be able to fully appreciate the depth of the revelation found inside of it. This principle of Torah study is most important. Closely connected with this rule is the principle of studying the Torah in the Hebrew language, its original language. There are sometimes that the words, thoughts, or concepts in the Hebrew of the Torah are almost impossible to express in translation. For example, it is helpful to know that the Hebrew word sometimes transliterated into English as sacrifice, or it's translated into English as sacrifice, is the word korban, which comes from the same root as the word meaning to draw close. Hence, an offering is that which helps us draw close to Elohim. In addition, there are virtually no English equivalents for the Hebrew word tahor and tameh, often rendered as pure and impure, or clean and unclean. While it is difficult for most people to learn biblical Hebrew or to know the background of the Torah, there are many study aids that can assist the novice in these pursuits. Nothing, however, can substitute for a working knowledge of both biblical Hebrew and ancient Near Eastern history. So, here are the 6 basic hermeneutical rules that need to govern our study of the Torah. It's important to remember that we can apply these rules in our study of any part of the scriptures. To recap: 1. Rely on the Spirit of Elohim to be our teacher. 2. Determine what type of literature we are studying. 3. Become an expert in the text. 4. Consider the context. 5. Understand the text at face value and avoid the temptation to algorize. And finally, 6. Know the historical, geographical, cultural, and religious backgrounds of the passage. Now, I want to move on to specifically studying the Torah. The Torah contains some unique material which we will call teaching sections. These are the sections that many people refer to as law. Most of the Tanakh does not contain this type of content. Therefore, in addition to the above rules, we also need to know the following specific suggestions for studying these unique type of passages in the Torah. We will repeat at least two of the previous principles because of their special application to the study of the teaching sections of the Torah. Number one is context. There's a definite context to most, if not all, of the long passages of teaching and instruction which so characterize the Torah. To be sure, it is sometimes rather difficult to determine the specific historical or literary context. But remember that the Torah was not given out of a vacuum. To understand it properly, we need to discern a context for each section. Take the concept of blood, for example. Instructions about blood, whether human or animal, are a major feature in the book of Leviticus. When we look at the teaching passages, therefore, we need to ask why Elohim is teaching about blood in this particular passage, as well as what these specific teachings add to the context of the whole book of Leviticus. The second one is the historical background. This is highly critical when we study the teaching sections of the Torah. Elohim had definite reasons for giving each of his teachings, some of which arose out of certain situations taking place outside of its pages. We need to become aware of these background circumstances in order to understand these sections completely. Here's an excellent example. The text says, quote, "And you shall not shave the corners of your head." To understand this passage properly, we must first determine from the Hebrew what the text means. Second, we must ask ourselves a question. Why would Elohim have given this instruction? Is he telling us how to get a haircut? What was happening historically at that time that would necessitate special instructions from the Holy One about our hairdo? If we examine the culture of the Canaanites, we would find that the Canaanites were literally cutting designs in their hair, much as some people do today. Moreover, they were doing so for religious purposes. Thus, we discover that, most likely, Elohim's instructions concerning our hair were intended to prevent us from acting like the Canaanites or practicing their religion. Hence, in the course of our research, we discovered that this teaching actually has very little to do with the peyot, or the long side curls that some wear, that are worn by many of the very religious Jewish men. Point 3 is this passage quoted in the Brit Hadashah? This is very important. If the passage under question is mentioned in the Brit Hadashah, or the Renewed Covenant, we may be able to learn at least two possible things from its usage there. Firstly, we are able to see how this passage was understood by others who lived closer than we do to the time it was written. And secondly, we may be able to learn how that teaching was practiced by those who are a part of that same essential culture. One of the best examples we can think of is a passage in Deuteronomy. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of Elohim. This verse is quoted in Matthew chapter 4. Here we are afforded an opportunity to see how the Messiah himself understood and applied this verse from the Torah. Point 4 is, how was this teaching practiced in ancient Israel? Determining how the ancient Israelites understood a teaching in the Torah can help us in our understanding of that passage. For example, it is beneficial to know that the Orthodox Jewish practice of laying tefillin binding a box containing portions of the Torah to one's forehead and on their arm during prayer, as in Deuteronomy chapter 6, apparently teaches that it was practiced by those who lived in the Second Temple period. We have ample evidence of this from both archaeological and literary sources. If Israel has been following an instruction of the Torah for centuries, perhaps we too might benefit from practicing it as they do, so long as we do not contradict the written word. Point 5. How do Jewish people practice this teaching today? Jewish practice and interpretation of the Torah began centuries ago, in many cases even before the time of Yeshua. Although we do not believe in the authority of the oral law to contradict the written law, it nevertheless contains much that is useful for us today, such as incredibly insightful periodic interpretation of the Torah. It is helpful for us, therefore, to read some of the best of the modern Jewish commentators, at least those of both the Rishon and the Akarim, because in them we may find accurate interpretations of the most difficult passages of the Torah. Moreover, it can also be helpful to examine some of the rabbinic applications of the Torah as given some of these halach teachings that might shed some light for us on a given passage. And finally, number 6. What Torah picture is painted by the passage? At first glance, the concept of Torah pictures may seem similar to that of types, so often employed by Bible teachers. But we're talking about something a little different here. A Torah picture answers the question, what does this instruction teach us about the person and the work of Yeshua? In addition, we can also ask, what does this Torah teaching illustrate concerning our identity in Messiah? For example, we find a wonderful Torah picture in the teaching concerning purity and impurity, tameh and tahor. Why did Elohim declare some things tameh and other things tahor? These words are often translated as unclean and clean. Are such objects or people really dirty or clean? Is that the intended meaning? The more we study the matter, the more a whole new universe of pictures opens up for us. Bearing in mind our prior warnings against spiritualization, we nevertheless can see that the concepts of tameh and tahor aptly illustrate our transformation from a state of uncleanliness to one of being able to approach Elohim's throne of grace. Yeshua has made us new creations, the sanctified instead of the sinners. No longer tahor, or now becoming tahor, no longer tameh. So the Torah pictures can help illustrate these truths and more. Next week in part 3, we'll conclude our study and we'll go over the principles of how to teach the Torah. Shalom, and see you next time.